Hi everyone and welcome to another Wallsend history story. This week I am returning to the pubs theme and covering the story of another of the lost pubs of Wallsend and Howden. Although not a full detailed history, I hope you will still enjoy it and find it interesting. The pub I am covering this week is the Railway Inn, later known as the Bogie Chain, which until quite recently used to stand on Miller's Bank in Willington Quay, just underneath the Willington Dean Viaduct, which is probably better known locally as the Seven Arches. The Railway Inn is also often listed as being on Western Road, but personally I would have said that it was actually on both. The pub did change its appearance a little over the years, but the main structure of the building remained the same, with those big old chimney pots. This is just one section of them that you can see on screen at the moment, which gave a clue as to how many fireplaces there once would have been inside. And the larger bricks on each corner at the front of the building, which I imagine would have been sandstone when it was first built, and they later ended up painted green in its last few years, so they really did kind of stand out and you could really see where they were. A lot of people also mention the Railway Inn as having the nickname of the Vatican. Some say because of the many Catholic people who drank there, which to me does make sense, as at one time places like Keelman's Row seemed to be mainly lived in by the Irish Catholics, and that would have been their local, but I am sure that others will have a different reason for why it had that nickname. Obviously, old photos of this pub are hard to find without copyright attached to them, so most of the photos you will see in this video will be more recent ones, or ones from the time of its demolition in 2019. It is thought that a pub stood on the site from the 1850s, with the earliest known publican being Jonathan Sulka in 1858. However, I was not really able to find any mention of the pub until around 1861, when a Mr. Robert Chambers of Willington Quay was laying down a challenge to either R. Wilson of Wallsend or someone known only as Carr of Walker for 100 or 130 yards race. The money on offer at the time was £3 and £5, which truly was a lot of money, as by today's standards that would be £440 and £733 respectively. It would seem that this was quite a common thing, as similar challenges were laid down in 1862 and 1863, so no doubt there were many more challenges like this over the years. I never found out if they were accepted or not though, or if they were, who won. Another advert in 1866 was asking for the return of a lost dog, which I assumed belonged to Mr. Sulka of Railway Inn. However, it seems the newspaper of the time printed his name as Stoker. His name does seem to have caused the newspapers a fair few issues, as I have seen several variations of it and very few of them are actually correct, and the census forms got it wrong on a few occasions as well. Jonathan was listed in the 1861 census as both a publican and an agricultural labourer, and in 1871 he was living in Keelman's Row and was no longer listed as a publican. I wasn't able to trace him too far, but I do know that by 1891 he was around 82 years old, a widower living with his son in Tynemouth. The next publican in the Railway Inn was John Hardy in around 1872. Just prior to this, John had worked as a butcher. Born in Wallsend in around 1835, John was married to Margaret and they lived at the Railway Inn with their 5 children. As was often the case with old public houses, they would frequently be used to hold inquests, and the Railway Inn was used many times for cases like Mary McCardle in 1873 and John Gibbon in 1877. Public houses were often used for this purpose as they were bigger, and it meant that all those who needed to be present would be able to attend, rather than trying to fit inside some of the small homes where people had lived. I also found many mentions of cases of drunk and disorderly at the Railway Inn, such as the case in 1878 when Thomas Maylie and Robert Conley were fined 6 shillings and sixpence each after Sergeant Spence had arrested them both when they had refused to leave when the landlord had asked them to. Patrick Monroe was fined 7 shillings in 1884 for arguing with Mrs. Hardy and refusing to leave, and John Whaler and Patrick Derrick, who were both fined 5 shillings in 1889, again for being drunk and refusing to leave the pub when they had been asked to. I did find many other stories like this, but I didn't want it to just all be about drunk and disorderly, but unfortunately the majority of stories that I found were about this kind of thing or details of inquests. By 1889, the publican of the Railway Inn was Joseph Emerson, and he was followed by John Ray in 1894. But from the census details, it would seem that Mr. Ray had been living in the Railway Inn since 1891, when he was living there with his wife Elizabeth and 2 of their children. He was still living there in 1901, but by then his wife had sadly died, and Mr. Ray himself died in 1909, and he was still the publican of the Railway Inn at that time, and an article appeared in the local papers asking all those with any claims on his estate to contact the solicitors as soon as possible. And he did have a fair estate of around £3,000 for people to make claims against. There would be a couple more publicans after Mr. Ray before John Robert George took over in around 1932. He was probably one of the more well-known landlords of the Railway Inn, with the pub gaining the nickname of Johnny George's because of him. It seems that John had worked his way up from a humble barman, once living in Townview Terrace, to being the innkeeper living in the Railway Inn. And in 1939, he is listed as living there with his wife Margaret, and Margaret also worked in the pub as a barmaid, and when John died in May of 1944, aged 58, she took over the running of the pub. John was buried, I believe, in Churchbank Cemetery. However, I did not find any details of a headstone. I am sure many of you listening will have heard stories about Johnny George's from the time when John George was in charge, so do please let me know about them in the comments. I don't have a full list of all the publicans or owners after this, but one of the last ones I know of in the 60s was Ray Harden in 1966. The pub continued to do well for many years after this, and in the 90s it got a makeover and a new name. It was then to be known as the Bogie Chain. And I did find an advert from October 1990 advertising the Bogie Chain menus, with prices for Sunday lunch at £3.25, and there was also a 3-course meal available for £7.50. And it seems that daily entertainment was normal too, as the advert also mentioned things for the kids like magic shows, puppet shows and special weekend events, though it doesn't quite say what the special weekend events might be. And of course it mentions that the restaurant is inside the train carriage, which was added to the side of the pub. The Old Railway Carriage is probably one of the main things that I remember about the pub. In its later years, like many pubs that went on the main high street, it began to struggle a little bit before finally closing its doors for good. The pub was then put up for sale, and for a while it seemed that no one was interested. Then it was eventually sold and planning was granted for housing to be built on the site. The pub was demolished in 2019 and the Old Railway Carriage was taken to the Allen Valley Railway Trust near Alnwick, which I keep saying I will go to one day, but as yet I have not actually been. And as I was quite close by during the demolition, I made the effort to get as many pictures as I possibly could, and the photos that you can see on screen at the moment were all taken by me. But if you want to see more, I do have a video which tries to show the demolition from start to finish, from the pub still standing to when there was nothing left but an empty plot of land. The building began of the new houses later in 2019 and they are now all occupied, though I have to admit that as nice as they look, I wouldn't actually fancy living right underneath the 7 arches. I know that many of you will have fond memories of the Railway Inn or the Bogie Chain, and some of you will remember it as both, but most, like me, will remember it more from when it became the Bogie Chain. I did go in once or twice, but it wasn't somewhere where I was a regular visitor. But I would love to hear your memories of the pub, so do let me know them in the comments below. I know that this is a relatively short story in terms of history, but I hope that you have still enjoyed it and found it interesting. And I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.